good evening, and welcome back to our YouTube channel, Fulfill the Game of Life. Now, as you can see behind me, it is a cold and rainy day here in Portugal, and we're down to our last day here in the meal in Esposende, Portugal, overlooking the coast. It's been a fantastic visit. Well, I want to get started by picking up off the last financial video. First of all, is the viewership for the financial video last time was better than it has been, so I want to thank you guys for tuning in for that. Now that you know what the inflation calculation really is and how it works, and you know that the real inflation rate must be somewhere between 7% and 10%, today I'm going to tell you the primary cause of inflation. It's fascinating. The other main point of the video, which I hope really stuck with people, is how to easily, in your mind, do the math for what type of inflation rate was necessary for prices to double in 10 years, because you're going to be surprised how well that lays into the cause for inflation as well. So just as a quick review, about 7% inflation causes a double in prices every 10 years. If you didn't watch that video, I encourage you to just pull it open. I know it's a fair amount of time, but trust me, the investment in understanding how it works is going to pay dividends, because in a couple of videos, we're going to take this subject to investing and how you use this knowledge to your benefit to make sure that you can retire early as well. So I'd like to start this video with a quote by Henry Ford. "It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe that there would be a revolution beginning tomorrow morning." As a little personal aside note on this, I would say I became aware of how this works about 3 years ago. And there was one quote that I heard, and once I began to study, it meant probably the most of any quote, maybe even in my lifetime. And here it is by John Maynard Keynes from his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. "By this means, the government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." Now, I must admit, when I first heard the quote, I didn't fully understand the impacts of it, but by the end of this video, you'll understand it as well, and you'll understand why that is such an important quote. To continue quoting John Maynard Keynes, when he speaks of this means, what is he referring to? Here's an additional comment from the same book as well. "By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. And while this process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some." Again, I find it fascinating as I'd worked myself to retirement, and I now have time in retirement to understand what these comments were and how they're built, and why these brilliant men from many, many decades ago were able to put these things in writing and understand what was actually occurring. So, enough with the niceties and the quotes. Let's get started. What are the causes for inflation? Now, just for a moment before we really get rolling, let me review once again what inflation means. It basically means that the dollar gets weaker over time. It means, said simply, that the dollar will buy less and less goods as time goes forward. It basically is devaluing the dollar. The dollar is worth less. Now, before I tell you the real cause for inflation, I want to tell you what you hear is the cause for inflation. What's almost exclusively explained to citizens through the news are what I would call micro causes for inflation. These causes are real, it's not fake news, such as there's a drought in the middle of the United States and the crop yield is low, so the cost of corn rises. Well, that's real, and it does happen. And there are other things, hurricanes or things that ruin crops, or chip shortages as they have now. And those things are real, but they're micro causes, meaning they're valid to the one product or the two products only, but not to the entire economy. So what does cause inflation to the entire economy? Well, as I said in the previous video, it is by design. Enter Monetary Theory 101. Primary cause for inflation at an economic countrywide level is money creation. You do often hear in radio and television and mass media how money printing is affecting the economy. Well, that is the real answer, but understanding it clearly is going to take us a few moments here. You can't understand how something works if you don't take just a moment to understand the history. And the history of money creation aligns with the history of central banking. Central banking is one bank has the authority given to it by the country in which it resides to control the creation and the use of money. The ability to create money and control the monetary system may be the single most powerful force on all of the planet. It is so powerful that Mayer Amschel Rothschild, from the infamous Rothschild family, once stated, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." Now, I will say that the history of the central banking system and the Rothschilds themselves is videos upon videos and well beyond the scope of this video. However, if you're interested and you have the time, because you retire early by watching these videos and making good decisions, you should spend some time. It's fascinating. However, we're not so concerned about their history. We're concerned with the creation of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is the central banking system of the United States of America. It was created in 1913 with the passing of the 16th Amendment, and it established not only the Federal Reserve, in the same year the IRS was created and the federal tax system as we know it. Is it a coincidence that in 1913 the Federal Reserve, the IRS, and the federal tax system as we know it are all created in the same year? Probably not, and you're about to see why. Since its establishment, the Federal Reserve has managed the money in the United States and the overall economy with the overall goal of stable economic growth. The two main tools used by the Federal Reserve is setting the national interest rate, in which banks borrow from the Federal Reserve and then people like you and I borrow from the banks. But the second is the creation and control of the supply of money around the United States of America. But before we walk a detailed example of how this works, there's one more historical event that absolutely changed the future of the American economy and the American people forever. In 1971, the United States of America left the gold standard.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Now, for a moment, let's understand what the gold standard was. After World War II, the American dollar was chosen as the global world currency, and it was agreed that every dollar bill that was printed would have the equivalent amount of gold held in a vault by the United States, that for any citizen who decided they wanted their gold, they could take the reserve notes into the bank and request gold that is exactly equal to the money in their hands. Now, once again, a history all into itself is how the United States eventually had to leave the gold standard, but it could be summarized as the United States continued to spend more money than they collected in taxes, and other countries began to be suspicious in the later 60s, actually asking for their gold in return, exposing to the world that the United States actually did not have the gold reserves required to refund these countries the amount of gold that they held in currency. Now, interesting little thing is he uses the word temporary. It's only been 50 years. Surely it was just a temporary departure from the gold standard. Now, it cannot be stated enough how significant the decision to leave the gold standard in 1971 was to the people of the United States and the world overall. Nixon essentially handed the keys to the nation to the Federal Reserve, and the theft of inflation was given a free pass at that moment in history. So, we arrive at an attempt to explain how the monetary system of the United States and practically all of the world who has their own central banks works. But the challenge here once again lies in Einstein's quote that if you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. So after months of trying to think about a way to explain this so it makes a complex system very easy to understand, here is my attempt. So I want to set up the simplest possible example, and we'll start with this. Imagine that there is one bank. Imagine that there is one house that is owned by the bank, and imagine that there is one man, and that man has all of the gold in the world in his hands. He owns the gold. So the bank owns the house, the man owns the gold. Now, in our example, the man wakes up one day and says, you know what, I would really like to buy the house. And the bank says the house just happens to be for sale and it's for the exact same amount as 1 bar of gold. So the man happily says, I will exchange this bar of gold for this house. After the transaction, the man walks in and lives in his house, and the bank takes the gold bar into the vault, locks the door so it's nice and secure. Some time passes and the bank says, you know what, this gold bar is just too heavy to spend and it's not broken into pieces that can be spent easily. So I think what I'll do is print paper currency so I don't have to carry around gold coins. So the bank opens up the printing press and prints a $100 bill. And the $100 bill is exactly equal to the 1 bar of gold, which is exactly equal to the price of the house. So it's essentially the gold standard. However, one fine day, the president of the bank says, hey, why don't we consider printing more than $100? And sets out to create a second $100 bill. So at the end of that day, the bank now has 2 $100 bills, 1 bar of gold, and the man still owns his house. As time passes once again, the owner of the house finally says, you know what, it's time to move, I want to leave the area, so I'd like to sell my house. So he puts a for sale sign out in the front yard of his house, and the bank sees it and says, you know what, we would love to own that house again. The bank approaches the man to buy his house again and offers him how much money? Now, the man can respond in 2 different ways. One would be to be uninformed of how money works by saying, I gave you gold that was worth $100 and you gave me the house. So it seems fair that I would sell the house to you for $100 in return. Now, at this moment, if this man is not aware that the bank has printed $200, he has essentially sold his house for $100 or half the gold. Now, let's face it, that scenario doesn't really happen because there are a lot of sophisticated investors who actually understand what happens. However, the general public is very rarely, if ever, informed that it works this way. What the sophisticated investor who owns the house says is, hey, I know I bought this for an entire bar of gold, and I know you printed $100 that was equal to that bar of gold, but I am also aware that you printed another $100 bill. So, for my house to be equal to that bar of gold, it now must be equal to all $200 that you printed. So the house that the man owns, his asset, has moved from a value of $100 to a value of $200 because the bank has printed twice as much money as they have gold. So by printing the extra $100, the value of the dollar declined by half, and the value of his home doubled. So this is a hopefully very clear example that how money printing actually creates a devalued dollar. The more money that is printed, the less valuable the dollar is, and the less valuable the dollar is exactly the definition of inflation. So money printing is exactly the cause of inflation. Because this won't actually just apply to the house itself, but it will apply to everything in the economy. So the apple that used to be bought at the market for $1 now costs $2 because the value of the currency is half of the value it was before the second $100 was printed. So that explains how inflation works and how money printing creates it. And money printing is probably not the best word. Money creation is a better definition because it's not necessary to physically print dollars to get them into the economy. Most things today happen electronically and are just digits typed into a computer. So, do you doubt that that is the explanation? And do you doubt that money is literally created out of nothing by our banking systems? Well, here's a quote from the former director of the Bank of England. And he once said, "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented." Or, founder of the Bank of England in 1694 once stated, "The bank hath benefit of interest of all monies which it creates out of nothing." Though I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this topic as well, it is important to understand that in my example, obviously the bank doesn't usually buy the house back. What actually happens is another buyer says, "I'd like to buy that house." But they also have to get a loan. So where do they go? The bank. So the bank, who's printed the extra $100, easily loans the $100 to the second party to go buy the home, which is essentially a creation of money. Once again, this concept is called fractional reserve banking. The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. So there you have it, and now you can actually see how money is created. And you can actually see that inflation is a direct result from creating money. But we need to do just a little more work to drive this home to provide the proof other than words. So how can we prove that printing money ties to inflation? Well, the good news is at least the legislation forces the reporting by the Federal Reserve of how much money is in existence. Since it controls it, it also has to measure it. So we're going to go straight to the Fed's webpage. We're going to look at their chart for the monetary base, which is one of the three measures they use to estimate how much money is actually in circulation in the United States. But you're going to be shocked by how well this ties to inflation. So we're going to go back once again to our original video where we talked about an inflation rate of 7% equals a doubling in prices every 10 years. So the question would be, if we think that printing money equals inflation almost exactly and is the primary cause for the nation's inflation, what should we expect to see when we look at the overall money supply in the United States? Well, if inflation doubles every 10 years, we would expect the money supply to double every 10 years. And if they both double every 10 years, the basic math of the gold example, double printing the gold and devaluing the currency at exactly the rate of printing extra money, will have proven definitively that the monetary base, the amount of money that's flowing through the United States economy, ties directly to inflation. Now, as you can see here from the Fed of St. Louis, one of the actual websites of the different branches of the Federal Reserve, in 1970, right about the time the United States left the gold standard, the monetary base for the entire United States of America was $76.4 billion. And we fast forward exactly one decade, and the monetary base has moved to $156 billion, which is almost precisely a doubling in the total monetary base of the United States. So you think, okay, that may be coincidence. So let's go ahead and jump ahead to 1990. Well, in 1990, $293 billion, which is, once again, almost exactly double the $156 billion in 1980. So what about the year 2000? Are you guessing what number it would be now? $601 billion of monetary base, which once again is almost precisely double 1990. Now, this should start to look pretty familiar from video 1. So, does this break down in 2010? Well, yes, it actually does break down in 2010. What we would have expected to see in 2010 was about $1.2 trillion of monetary base. But what we actually saw was a lot worse. $1.9 trillion, almost $2 trillion of monetary base. But we do all have to understand that what happened here was the housing crash in the United States in 2008 and the Federal Reserve's first application of quantitative easing, which could basically be defined as printing even more money and forcing it into the banking network in order to prop up the economy. Now, fast forwarding on into 2020, you might hope that the Federal Reserve said, look, we're aware that we had to overprint our quantitative easing. Maybe we will underprint the money supply in this decade in which to control inflation. So, what did we actually see at the monetary base in 2020? Well, along came COVID, and now we're at $3.4 trillion in 2020. So, now we're in a new phase in which the Federal Reserve once again has to step in to, quote, save the economy. And how did they go about doing that? Well, they took off printing even more money. This started at the pandemic when so many people lost their jobs and employment and business declined, and it should have occurred to the average citizen, how in the world did the stock market continue to rise and remain stable although people didn't have a job and a huge decline in demand all the way across the country? Well, money printing. So in a 1-year period from 2020 to 2021, it has almost doubled in a 1-year period. Why do you think the Federal Reserve did that? Well, as we mentioned, it propped up the stock market. And how did it prop up the stock market, you say? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. If a stock was worth $100 and they printed 20% more money, well, the dollar that's buying the stock is now 20% less valuable. So in order to buy the same stock, the $100 is now $120. So the increase of the money supply floated the stock market. However, the bad side of floating the stock market with an increase in base monetary funds is the creation of inflation. So what's happening in the United States today? I watched a report just a couple of days ago that shows bacon year over year is up over 20%. Used cars up over 45%. It's not that these products have become more valuable, it is the dollar that is being used to purchase it has become less valuable. So, the total picture of inflation should be pretty clear to you. The role that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, plays in creating money has a direct causation to creating inflation. So now you fully understand it, or at least I hope you do. Obviously, taking one bar of gold and one house doesn't represent the whole economy, but the concept is strong in its foundations, and it is known. And this money printing, as you can see on the historical chart from the Federal Reserve, was perfectly in line with doubling the monetary base every decade, which falls directly in line to the inflation calculations that we showed in the prior video. They may not be exactly one for one, and there is a known delay of 3 to 4 to 5 months after the money is printed before the inflation actually occurs. So you know where it is now. You know how it happens. So what is the use of learning all of this? Well, it makes you a much wiser investor. And if you tune in to the next 2 videos, in the very next video, I'm going to answer in this known system that generates the effects that we observe, who wins, who loses, which side are you on, and in the video following, we're going to ask the question, how do you create a winning environment for you personally so you can retire early and for your family and your subsequent generations? I promise you, you don't want to miss it. This will leave the conceptual side and go to the practical side in just a couple of more videos. And I'll actually start sharing how I personally invest in order to take these inflationary calculations into account to create a secure retirement. So you're not going to want to miss it. So if this video helps you understand how the world works, I feel like I've achieved my goal. I hope that you tune in for the next video. If you enjoyed this, give me a thumbs up and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And we are still working on the secondary channel, which will get these videos transferred over to them. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed it.